Have you ever wondered, like really wondered, if you can truly know what's going on in someone else's mind?
Or if the whole idea of another mind is something we just, you know, kind of make up.
It's a real head scratcher.
A classic philosophical problem, the problem of other minds.
And you, I'd bet, with your philosophical brain, you've probably run into this in a textbook or two.
But here's the thing. Even the experts don't all agree on what the problem is exactly, or how to solve it.
So for this deep dive, we're going to use the sources you sent us to, really get into it.
We've got a lot to work with here, from historical perspectives all the way to current debates.
Oh, yeah, we've got analytic philosophy, continental philosophy, even some psychology and neuroscience thrown in.
A real mix. And what's really interesting, especially for someone like you who loves philosophy, is that we're not just going to be listing facts.
Right, it's not just a knowledge dump.
We're going to dig into the core concepts, look at the logic behind the arguments, and explore all the different ways philosophers have tackled this question.
The goal is to give you a clear understanding of the debate, highlight the sticking points.
And maybe, just maybe, spark some of those aha moments as we go along.
We'll try to keep things clear and avoid getting too bogged down in jargon.
The focus is on the big ideas.
So let's start with what many consider the starting point, the traditional epistemological problem. This is where skepticism comes in.
Ah, yes. Skepticism, that old philosophical favorite.
Think back to Descartes and his radical doubt. How our senses can deceive us, the dream argument, that whole evil demon thing.
Right, the idea that we could be completely wrong about everything.
Well, philosophers have applied this kind of radical doubt to other minds.
If we can't be sure about the physical world, how can we be sure about what's happening inside someone else's head?
This leads to those thought experiments about everyone else being like a sophisticated robot, just going through the motions without actually feeling anything.
Automata, zombies, that sort of thing.
And then there's solipsism, the unnerving possibility that maybe you're the only conscious mind in existence.
That's the strong version.
The weak version is more like, just worrying that you might be misinterpreting what someone's thinking or feeling.
Which happens all the time, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. But that strong version, the idea of being utterly alone in the universe of consciousness, that's a whole other level of mind-blowing.
Now, as Gomes points out, the problem of other minds isn't just about dealing with this radical skepticism.
Okay, so there's more to it than just, do we really know?
Exactly. Sometimes the more interesting question, philosophically speaking, is about how we know. Like, what are the sources of our knowledge? Austin, for example, asks, how do we know someone is angry?
Which is different from asking, do we ever know?
Right. And this highlights a kind of asymmetry. We have this direct, immediate access to our own minds.
But when it comes to other people's minds,
Mm-hmm.
it's like we have to go through this indirect route, through their behavior.
Which, of course, can be misleading.
It's like there's this fundamental gap. Ayer makes a good point about this. He said that while you could have experienced the past if you were there, you can't just be someone else.
Right. It's logically impossible. You're you, and they're them.
And even if we could somehow directly experience someone else's feelings, like through telepathy or something,
That's a popular idea.
it still wouldn't solve the problem. Because those feelings would then become your feelings, not theirs.
So the core problem remains. How do we bridge this gap between minds?
It seems impossible. And yet, we do believe other people have minds.
We do. So how can we justify that belief?
Well, one of the oldest and most debated attempts is the argument from analogy.
The classic example.
It goes something like this. We know other people have bodies like ours, and they act in similar ways.
They walk, talk, laugh, cry.
And from our own experience, we know that our actions are caused by our thoughts and feelings. So it seems reasonable to think that when others act in similar ways, they're having similar experiences.
It's a kind of common sense approach. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck,
It probably has a duck mind.
something like that.
But as appealing as it seems, the argument from analogy runs into some problems.
Oh yeah, some big ones.
For one thing, we can never really verify if our conclusion about another mind is right.
Locke made this point way back when. It's not like we can crack open someone's skull and look inside.
And also, drawing a general conclusion based on just one example, your own experience, seems pretty shaky.
It's not exactly a solid foundation.
But maybe the biggest problem is that the whole analogy rests on the assumption that I know what it's like to think and feel in my own case.
Which might not be as simple as it sounds.
Right. Malcolm, following Wittgenstein, really questioned this whole idea of knowing our own minds through this kind of private inward gaze.
The private language argument comes into play here.
Exactly. If a language is based on purely private sensations, how can we be sure we're using the words correctly?
There's no external check, no way to correct each other.
And Malcolm argues that relying on this private understanding of our own minds leads us down a path towards conceptual solipsism,
Where the only mind you can really grasp is your own.
which is kind of a philosophical dead end, isn't it?
Now, some philosophers have tried to rescue the argument from analogy.
Okay, so they weren't ready to give up on it.
Some have drawn parallels to how we reason about the past, events we can't directly observe anymore.
We use analogy there too.
But the problem with other minds isn't just that we can't observe them directly, it's that it's logically impossible to verify our conclusions.
So it's not just a practical limitation, it's a deeper philosophical issue.
Exactly. Hislop and Jackson suggest a different strategy.
Okay, so what do they say?
They say, if we can establish a link between our mental states and our behavior in our own case, and if we assume that nature is generally uniform,
Meaning that similar causes tend to produce similar effects.
right, then we can reasonably infer that others who exhibit similar behavior are probably having similar mental states. Hislop even argues that relying on our own case is actually a strength, not a weakness.
Interesting. So they're flipping the script on that criticism.
They are, but Malcolm comes back with a counter-argument.
He doesn't let up.
He says this approach still makes the mistake of thinking we learn about mental states through some kind of inward glance in isolation.
But he doesn't think that's how it works.
Instead, he argues for what he calls a criterial view.
Okay, so how does that work?
It's about seeing the connection between mind and behavior as more fundamental, not as a cause and effect relationship.
So it's not that our mind causes our behavior, but that our behavior shows us what's going on in our mind.
In a way, yes. It challenges that whole Cartesian picture of the mind as this hidden inner realm,
And it suggests that behavior is how we express and understand mental states.
which ties into how we use language, the rules and conventions we have for talking about these things.
It's a pretty big shift in perspective.
So, if the argument from analogy has all these problems, where does that leave us?
Yeah, how else can we understand other minds?
Well, another approach is the argument from best explanation.
Okay, so what's that one about?
The idea here is that the best way to explain why people act the way they do, all those complex behaviors, is to assume they have minds like ours.
It's like when scientists say things like, we can't see electrons, but they're the best explanation for how electricity works.
Exactly. Chalmers, for example, thinks this argument has a lot of potential.
It's a pretty common way of thinking in science. We go with the explanation that makes the most sense, that fits the evidence.
And Pargetter argues that the alternative explanations are just too implausible.
Like, what are those alternatives?
Well, one is that we're all just puppets controlled by some external force, like God or something.
That's a bit out there.
Another is that you're unique, and everyone else has these radically different minds that you can't even fathom.
Which doesn't seem very likely.
And those explanations just don't account for the complexity and coherence of human behavior.
But not everyone's convinced.
Right. Melnick points out a key difference between scientific realism and belief in other minds.
What's that difference?
He says that with science, we have independent evidence for the things we can't observe directly. But with minds, we don't.
So just seeing someone act in a certain way might not be enough to prove they have a mind. We need something more.
He suggests that we need a more nuanced account, maybe one that combines analogy with inference to the best explanation.
So it's not a simple either-or situation.
Which brings us to another important concept: criteria.
Criteria.
This is a big idea in Wittgenstein's later work. It challenges the idea of the mind as this hidden cause behind behavior.
Okay, so instead of the mind causing behavior, what does it say?
It says that behavior itself can be the criterion for mental states.
So we don't infer the mind from behavior, we see the mind in the behavior.
You could put it that way. It's a pretty radical idea.
It goes against that whole Cartesian picture of the mind as private and inaccessible.
Exactly. Wittgenstein makes a distinction between criteria and symptoms in his Blue Book.
So what's the difference?
A symptom is just a sign that something else is going on, like a runny nose being a symptom of a cold.
But a criterion is more like a defining feature.
Right. It's tied to how we use a word, the rules and conventions of our language.
But not everyone agrees with this idea of criteria.
Oh, it's been hotly debated. Chihara and Fodor, for example, they argue that using criteria to understand the mind is basically behaviorism.
which reduces mental states to just observable actions.
And they think that's not enough. They say we need to consider the role of mental states within a larger explanatory system, kind of like how physicists understand unobservable particles.
So they agree that we don't learn about minds just by looking inward, but they think there's more to it than just looking at behavior.
Exactly. And the debate about criteria continues. Wright and McDowell, for instance, they have different interpretations.
Okay, so how do they differ?
Wright sees criteria as giving us a kind of entitlement to claim we know something.
So if the criteria for pain are met, like someone's crying and holding their arm, we're entitled to say they're in pain.
But this entitlement is defeasible, meaning it could be overturned if we get new information.
So there's still room for doubt.
Whereas McDowell thinks that genuine knowledge can't be defeasible. He argues that if we really know something, there's no chance we could be wrong.
So for him, criteria have to be more absolute.
Right. And this connects to his view of direct perception, which we'll talk about in a bit.
And then there's Cavell. He has a whole other take on criteria.
He's a very interesting philosopher.
He's less focused on the certainty of our judgments and more on how we apply concepts.
He shifts the focus from how can I know to how do I respond.
So it's not just about knowing, it's about doing something.
Exactly. He talks about how our attitude towards another person is an attitude towards a soul.
That's a powerful idea.
And he introduces the concept of acknowledgement. It's about actively responding to another person, recognizing their humanity.
It goes beyond just understanding them intellectually. It's about engaging with them on a deeper level.
Which brings us to a more recent development in philosophy. Perceptual knowledge of other minds.
Perceptual knowledge. So we can actually perceive other minds.
Well, that's the claim. It challenges the traditional view that we can only know about minds indirectly by inferring from behavior.
Which has been the dominant view for centuries.
Thinkers like Augustine, Descartes, Berkeley, they all held this view. And even more recently, philosophers like McGinn have argued that the idea of directly perceiving another mind is just incoherent.
But then you have someone like Duddington, who argued that our knowledge of other minds is just as direct as our knowledge of physical objects.
A bold claim. And while Duddington might not have convinced everyone right away, this idea of direct perception has gained a lot of traction in recent decades.
So how does it work? How can we perceive minds directly?
Well, McDowell, for example, argues that our perceptual experience is fundamentally open to the world.
Meaning, we don't just perceive sense data.
Yeah.
We perceive things as they are.
Yes, and he extends this to mental states. He says that expressive behavior gives expression to those states.
So when we see someone genuinely expressing pain, we're not just seeing their behavior, we're seeing their pain itself.
That's the idea. Of course, we can be fooled sometimes. People can fake their emotions.
So how do we account for that?
McDowell uses what he calls a disjunctive account.
Meaning there are two possibilities.
Exactly. Either the behavior is genuinely expressive or it just seems that way. And when it's genuinely expressive, our perception gives us real knowledge of the other mind.
So for McDowell, expressive behavior is more than just evidence. It's a criterion for the mental state.
And then we have Gretzky, who takes a different approach. He's less focused on refuting skepticism and more on figuring out the source of our knowledge.
So how does he see it?
He distinguishes between non-epistemic seeing, which is just the physical act of seeing, and epistemic seeing, which involves having a belief about what you see.
So we might see someone smiling, but we don't necessarily know they're happy.
Right. Gretzky says we can see that someone is happy without seeing their happiness itself.
Kind of like how we can see that a stove is hot without seeing the heat itself.
Exactly. And for Gretzky, the key to epistemic seeing is reliability. The circumstances have to be such that the person wouldn't look happy unless they were actually feeling happy.
So it's about knowing when our perception is giving us accurate information.
And Kassan tries to bring these two views together. He says that behavior manifests mental states the way McDowell describes, allowing us to know what someone feels, while Gretzky shows how we can know this without actually perceiving the mental state itself.
It's interesting how these different philosophers are trying to find a way to make sense of this idea that we can have direct access to other minds.
It's a pretty intuitive idea, really. We often feel like we just see what others are feeling.
And this idea of direct access is also a big part of the phenomenological tradition.
Oh yeah, phenomenology is all about experience.
Thinkers like Scheller and Merleau-Ponty, they were very critical of the argument from analogy. They thought it started from the wrong place. with the isolated self,
They emphasized embodied subjectivity.
meaning that we're not just minds floating in space, we're bodies embedded in the world and connected to others.
Right. Heidegger's idea of Mitsein, being with, is a good example of this.
And for them, the goal wasn't so much to prove that other minds exist, but to understand how shared experience is even possible.
And they argued that we have a kind of direct awareness of other minds through expressive behavior.
So we can see joy in a genuine laugh or
Mm.
sadness in tears.
Exactly. Scheller talks about the expressive unity of behavior, how the mind and body work together to express the person as a whole.
Einstein, she has this concept of empathy, which she sees as a way of directly perceiving another's consciousness.
It's not the same as ordinary perception, but it's still direct.
She emphasizes the experience of the other as other.
There's a sense of distance, of recognizing their separateness.
And both Stein and Scheller bring in an ethical dimension to their work on intersubjectivity.
It's not just about knowing, it's about how we treat each other.
So, to go back to the distinction between indirect and direct accounts,
It's more than just perception versus inference.
it's about challenging that whole mind-body dualism.
The idea that the mind is separate from the body, hidden away.
McDowell makes a good point about experiencing something that doesn't fall short of the inner state.
Meaning that even if we're not directly perceiving the mental state itself, our experience is still rich enough to give us real knowledge.
But there's still that issue of asymmetry.
The fact that we know our own minds differently from how we know other minds.
And Merleau-Ponty and Wittgenstein both had interesting things to say about that, about the different roles our own expressions play compared to the expressions of others.
Now, some philosophers argue that there's an even deeper problem, the conceptual problem of other minds.
Conceptual problem. So
Mhm.
it's not just about how we know, but about how we even understand.
Exactly. Philosophers like Nagel and Bilgrami think this is the more fundamental issue.
It's like before we even ask how we know, we need to ask how we can even conceive of another mind.
And this goes back to Wittgenstein and his famous Section 302 in the Philosophical Investigations, where he talks about imagining someone else's pain.
That's a tough one.
Malcolm sees this as part of Wittgenstein's attack on the idea of a private language.
Because if our concept of pain is based on our own private experience, how can we even imagine it in someone else?
It leads us towards conceptual solipsism.
Where the only mind we can grasp is our own. And McGinn makes a similar point. He says our understanding of subjective experiences has this first-person element that makes it really hard to imagine those experiences in another being.
It's easy to imagine a pain in your own body moving from one place to another. But imagining your pain as someone else's pain, that's a whole other thing.
It's like it doesn't even make sense.
And Evans's generality constraint adds another layer to this. He says that to think about something having a property, you need a general concept of that property that's not tied to just one instance.
So, if our concept of pain is based only on our own experience, how can we apply it to others?
Right. It becomes problematic.
But Strawson offers a way out. He argues that our concept of a person is primitive, meaning it includes both mental and physical aspects.
So to think of someone as a person is already to think of them as having a mind.
In a way, yes. He thinks the concepts of mind and body are inseparable in our understanding of a person.
And he hopes that by addressing this conceptual problem, the epistemological problem might just go away.
So if we understand minds correctly, the question of how we know about them becomes less important.
Exactly. Strawson talks about bridging the mind-behavior gap. Of course, this raises the worry of behaviorism.
That we're reducing minds to just behavior.
But the response is that expressive behavior is richer than just simple movements. It has meaning.
And McDowell, echoing Strawson, says we need to reclaim our concept of a human being from this reduced idea of a human body.
We need to see people as whole persons, not just collections of physical parts.
It feels like we're moving away from these abstract debates and towards a more grounded understanding of how we actually interact with others.
Which brings us to what's called the naturalist turn in the philosophy of mind.
Naturalist turn. What's that about?
It's about focusing on how we actually understand minds in our everyday lives, not just on philosophical theories.
So more empirical, less theoretical?
Exactly. Goldman distinguishes between the normative epistemological problem, which is about justification,
Like, how do we know we're right?
and the descriptive epistemological problem, which is about how we actually do it.
So what's the process, the mechanisms involved?
Right. And this naturalist approach looks to psychology and neuroscience for answers.
And this is where we get into theory and simulation theory.
Two big contenders in cognitive science.
Okay, so what are those about?
Theory says that we develop a kind of theory of mind, a set of beliefs and rules about mental states that we use to understand others.
So it's like we're little scientists building theories about how other people's minds work.
In a way, yes. A key experiment for testing this is the false belief task.
What's that?
It's about seeing if someone understands that another person can have a belief that's not true.
Like if you put a toy in a box and then someone else comes in and doesn't see you move it, will they still think it's in the box?
Exactly. And there's a lot of debate about how children develop this ability.
Do they start with a simple theory and then refine it? Or is it more like a switch that flips on at a certain age?
Good question. And this theory approach has links to the best explanation argument and functionalism.
But it's faced some criticism too.
Oh yeah, plenty. Some studies suggest that even babies might have some understanding of false belief. And there's also the issue of whether failing a false belief task really means you don't understand other minds at all. Maybe it's just a performance issue.
So it's more complicated than it seems.
As always. Now, simulation theory is a different story. It says that we understand others by simulating their mental states in our own minds.
So we put ourselves in their shoes and see what we would think and feel.
Exactly. It's about understanding from the inside out. Proponents like Gordon and Heel emphasize this.
And the discovery of mirror neurons seem to support this idea.
Those neurons fire both when we do something and when we see someone else do the same thing.
So like our brain is mirroring their actions.
Some people thought so, but it's more complicated than that.
Of course it is.
Gallagher and Zahavi, they argued that both theory and simulation theory miss something important: interaction.
Meaning the back and forth between people.
Right. They think that direct, second-person interaction is crucial for understanding others.
We don't just observe, we respond.
Exactly. And they think mirror neurons are more about preparing for action and response, not about simulating mental states.
They also talk about primary and secondary intersubjectivity in infants.
Those early interactions where babies are already picking up on emotions and intentions.
And they argue that behavior isn't just a clue to the mind, it's part of what makes up the mind.
It's constitutive. And all this happens within the context of our shared world.
This interactionist view fits with enactivist theories of perception.
Where perception is seen as active and embodied, not just passive.
So we don't just receive information, we engage with the world.
And when we extend this to social interaction, it means that perceiving another person involves perceiving possibilities for action and engagement.
It's not just about seeing, it's about doing.
And then we have person model theory developed by Nguyen.
Another theory.
It's a challenge to both theory and simulation theory, and even to interaction theory in some ways.
So what's different about this one?
It suggests a more gradual development of our understanding of others. We start with a basic person schema as infants, and this develops into more complex person images as we get older.
So our understanding gets more sophisticated over time.
Exactly. And this theory suggests that we use different strategies depending on the situation. Sometimes we infer, sometimes we simulate, sometimes we perceive directly, and sometimes we interact.
So it's a more flexible approach.
And this aligns with the idea of a pluralist approach to understanding other minds.
Meaning that we use whatever works best in a given situation.
Right. And going back to Cavell, interaction theory also supports his idea of the duality in the problem of other minds.
It's not just about how I know you, but how you know me.
Exactly. Cavell says that the skeptic often overlooks the fear of not being understood. And expressive behavior is key for enabling acknowledgement.
It's about making ourselves known to others.
And there's an ethical dimension to this, a responsibility to acknowledge the humanity in others through our actions.
So it's not just about knowing, it's about being known.
It's fascinating to see how these current debates connect with how philosophers in the past thought about these issues.
Let's take a quick trip back in time.
Back to the philosophical archives.
If we look at the period from Descartes to Mill, we see Mill defending the argument from analogy against Reid's criticisms.
Reid was a big critic of Descartes. He thought the whole Cartesian framework led to solipsism.
Reid believed that both reason and perception were equally reliable sources of knowledge.
And he had these regulative principles, like the belief that other beings have life and intelligence, and that their expressions show their mental states.
So for him, it was just common sense to believe in other minds.
And then there's Malebranche, who is a very careful thinker. He made distinctions between how we know our own minds, how we know bodies, and how we know other minds.
He was more skeptical about other minds.
He even questioned whether other people's sensations are the same as ours.
And Arnauld, who was actually one of the first to articulate the argument from analogy.
He was ahead of his time. It's interesting to note that Descartes was a thick skeptic, doubting everything, while Malebranche's skepticism about other minds was more thin, focused on specific details.
And Locke, he was an empiricist. He focused on how we know things through experience.
He was interested in the ordinary acceptation of truth, how we understand things in our everyday lives.
In Berkeley, he was an idealist, meaning he believed that reality is ultimately mental.
Which raises some interesting questions about other minds.
He argued that we can infer other minds from the patterns we see in their behavior.
Like a collection of ideas that suggests a distinct mind.
Scholars debate whether this is analogy or causal inference. And then there's Hume, who introduced the idea of sympathy.
A key concept in his philosophy.
He thought sympathy was how we're affected by the mental states of others.
But there are different interpretations of what he meant. Some think he couldn't escape solipsism, while others see him as offering a psychological explanation for how we understand each other.
And Adam Smith, he challenged Hume's view of sympathy. He thought it was more about imagination, about putting ourselves in the other person's shoes.
Which sounds a lot like simulation theory, doesn't it?
It does. And Reid, going back to his critique of Descartes, he argued that seeing our relationships with others as just probabilistic inferences goes against our everyday experience.
We don't usually doubt that the people we interact with have minds.
He thought that social interaction was a fundamental part of our mental lives.
So even back then, philosophers were wrestling with these big questions about other minds.
And it's important to remember that this wasn't just a Western philosophical problem.
Other traditions have their own perspectives.
Classical Indian philosophy, for example, has a long history of thinking about these issues.
Especially within Buddhist thought.
Dharmakirti, a 7th century Buddhist philosopher, argued that we can infer other minds from speech and action.
He was very systematic in his thinking.
But he also recognized the limits of our understanding. We can't fully grasp the inner experiences of others.
Some scholars see his arguments as similar to the argument from analogy in Western philosophy.
And then there's Ratnakirti, an 11th century Buddhist philosopher who responded to Dharmakirti.
He raised some really interesting points.
He pointed out that we can't verify the existence of other minds.
And he ultimately accepted a form of solipsism.
But he also acknowledged that we need to act as if other minds exist to make sense of our own actions and social interactions.
It's a practical necessity.
And Ganeri, a contemporary scholar, says that Ratnakirti went even further, arguing that we can't even conceive of another mind that's truly separate from our own.
Which raises some profound questions about Buddhist compassion. If we can't even imagine another mind, how can we truly care for others?
It's amazing to see how these different philosophical traditions grapple with such similar questions.
It really shows how universal these questions are.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that the problem of other minds is a multifaceted one.
We've gone from skepticism and analogy to best explanation and criteria, from direct perception to interaction theory.
And we've touched on how these ideas have been explored across different philosophical traditions.
It's not a problem with a simple solution. It's an ongoing exploration.
And for someone like you, with a philosophical mind, this isn't just an intellectual exercise.
It's about understanding what it means to be human, to exist in a world with other minds.
The different approaches we've discussed highlight the richness and diversity of philosophical thought.
They show us the tools we have for thinking about these big questions.